This is Louisa Paiwensky from the USDOT Volpe Center. I am going to be moderating today's webinar on behalf of FHWA and AASHTO. We're expecting a few more participants, so we're going to give it about 1 more minute and we'll get started. Okay, why don't we get started? I think we have a number of people on the line, and as others join us, we'll try to catch them up if possible. As I mentioned, I'm Louisa Paiwensky from the USDOT Volpe Center, facilitating on behalf of FHWA and AASHTO. We're going to start with introductions, but first let us welcome you to the Regional Freight Data Collaboration and Standardization Forum. I know FHWA and AASHTO are very much looking forward to our in-person workshop in Portland, Oregon next week. So why don't we start with introductions. To make it easier, because we're all on a conference call, I'll go by state, and I'll start with asking for any state DOT representatives, followed by MPO, and then others. So why don't we start with our host state, Oregon? Anyone from the state DOT?
Yeah, this is Josh Roll from ODOT Research, Oregon DOT Research.
Welcome, Josh. Anyone else from ODOT? MPO representatives from Oregon? Okay. Washington State? State DOT reps? MPO?
Yeah, this is Sean Arducci with PSRC.
Thank you. Welcome, Sean. Anyone else from Washington State, MPO, or region? Okay. Alaska? State DOT? Or region? Montana?
This is Brian Anderson, GIS Manager at Department of Transportation.
Great. Thank you. Welcome. Anyone else from Montana, state or regional representatives? Okay, Idaho? State DOT? Region?
This is Lisa Aitkonen from the Community Planning Association of Southwest Idaho.
Welcome. Wyoming?
Mark Wingate, DOT.
Welcome, Mark.
And Tom Mason, Cheyenne MPO.
Welcome, Tom. And I understand we have a representative from the University of Washington.
Hi, this is Barb Ivanov from the Supply Chain, Transportation, and Logistics Center.
Okay. British Columbia? Okay. Is there anybody that I have missed? I understand we have James Garland from FHWA joining us today. Okay, possibly on mute. Okay, why don't we get started then? Brian, would you be able to forward the next slide, please? Thank you. First, I'd like to introduce the FHWA and AASHTO planning team. They have been working together for many months to put together this series of 8 workshops designed to produce regional action plans around freight data standardization and particularly collaboration. Jeff Purdy here from FHWA, Caitlin Dwyer and Brian Hong from AASHTO. Donald Ludlow is representing AASHTO as well, and he will be making a presentation during today's webinar. Next week's workshop in Portland will be the second of the series of 8. We started last month in Orlando, Florida, We had a very good workshop that did produce an actionable, excellent regional plan. We picked up some lessons. We asked them for suggestions on how to make the future workshops even better, and we're going to be applying some of these lessons learned into next week's workshop in Portland. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of today's webinar. We're going to talk about the goals of next week's workshop. We're going to talk to you about what the expectations are for you as participants in the workshop. Make sure that you come in with good knowledge of what to expect. We're going to talk about the current processes today, both from, particularly from FHWA, what some of the background is to what brought us here today in this webinar and then next week's workshop. You're going to be hearing from Caitlin Dwyer about the connection between regional freight data and planning. That will be at the workshop. In today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Donald, who will be talking about how data is used. And we're going to be talking in the workshop about some of the best practices and what other states are doing so that we can all learn from each other. We're going to be talking about one of the suggestions that we heard from the Florida participants. They suggested that we have what they called a speed dataing session, meaning that each of you would bring to the workshop some information about the data that you collect, what the sources are, how you use it, and whether or not it's available to share. You'll be hearing a little bit more in this webinar from Dawn about that. And then we're going to have a Q&A, give you an opportunity to ask any questions about the workshop, any travel logistics questions. We do want to remind you that the hotel and the location of the workshop are in two different places in Portland, so you'll have to make arrangements to get yourself from the hotel to the CH2M Hill offices where the workshop will be held. We will be speaking with the hotel to see if there's an opportunity to coordinate a van pool or a car pool for you there. But today's webinar agenda is scheduled to be 90 minutes. If it goes less than that, that's fine. We will not go more than that. Next slide, please. And so the reason that we're asking you to get together before meeting in person is that we want to make sure that all of you have the same baseline understanding of the products, the methods, what we're going to be talking about, and especially the background to this. The SHARP 2 program has been going on for years now. It is in full implementation. This is an example of implementing SHARP 2 products. So we want to make sure you not only understand where we're going, and you are going to be determining where we're going through the development of your action plan, but where we've been and how we've gotten there. We also will be giving you an overview of the agenda of the workshop, telling you what you need to know for the workshop, as well as what we expect you to bring in terms of participation. We want to have a preliminary conversation with you about how data is used. We learned a lot from our colleagues in Orlando. We'd like to hear more from you, both in person at the workshop, and if you'd like to discuss that further today, we will. But we want to give you a presentation about how it's used in other regions around the country. And we want to share information with you about the opportunities for improved collaboration and how it can specifically improve and enhance decision-making in your region. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of the workshop agenda in Portland next week. As you may have seen already, it is a day-and-a-half long workshop. We're going to be starting at 1 o'clock on day 1 in Portland. We're going to give an overview of the meeting, just for those of you who are not able to attend the webinar. Jeff Purdy is going to give you a little quick refresher on today's webinar, some of the things that you learned today. As I mentioned, Caitlin Dwyer will be talking about the freight connection with planning on behalf of AASHTO. Then, as we move toward the mid-afternoon, Donald Ludlow will be talking about freight data application scenarios and lay out a number of different scenarios and real-life examples of collaboration around freight in different parts of the country, identifying some of the better practices that you may wish to adapt for your own purposes. Then we will go into a session that you'll hear more about in today's webinar, the speed dataing session, asking you what your planning needs are, where do you get your data, how do you use it, can it be shared with others. One of the things we learned in Orlando is that some regions were not aware of the data that other regions had just next door, and sometimes even within a state, one agency didn't know what data the other one did. So they suggested, after hearing of those gaps, that the workshops be used as a means of collaborating and sharing data that existed in addition to identifying future data needs. You will be given a homework assignment for the next day. These truly are working workshops, so while we'll be working on arranging a group dinner after day one, we'll also be asking you to think about the regional action plan, which is really the ultimate product of this workshop. It is not just a workshop for talking about data. We are counting on you to develop a plan with actionable tasks that you can do with the support of AASHTO and FHWA or on your own to improve collaboration around freight data. The next morning, we're going to start really getting into the planning itself, your plan. We're going to start by covering gaps, having you identify for us what data might be missing, if it's located elsewhere, coming up with some thoughts on how to go get it. I do want to stress that it's about data, not modeling. The C2 product covered data and modeling, but this workshop is really just focused on data. So after identifying where some of the gaps are, we're going to give you a break and then have you put together the regional action plan. You may be doing it in breakout groups, you may be doing it as an entire group all together, but we're going to start asking you to identify means and methods of collaborating on data, whether you think peer exchanges are valuable, having a common data source, getting together for meetings, shared acquisition of data. You tell us what you think would work in your region. And then once after you build the regional action plan, we're going to ask you, if you are in breakout groups, to present to one another for some comments and feedback. We found that worked very well in Orlando. Each of the groups came up with some overlap, but some significantly different recommendations, and we think all put together, it represents a very viable regional action plan. And we have similar high hopes for the success of this regional action planning process next week in Portland. Then we'll close out the workshop on day 2 by explaining, giving you a very high-level overview of what we all agreed to make sure that you agree with what we summarized, and then identify for you next steps, when you can expect next to hear from us, and what we will be planning to do with the other workshops. So that's what you're going to get. It's going to be a very full day and a half in Portland, and we do have high expectations for your level of participation, meaning we're going to be asking everyone to speak. I'm going to be calling on everyone in the room. In Orlando, and I suspect next week in Portland, we won't have to push you too hard to start talking about the data gaps and what can be done to make it all work better. But do know that it's a relatively small workshop, so there will be opportunities for everyone to speak, and I'll be making sure that everybody does participate in the workshop. You'll be getting information, if you haven't already, from Brian Hong of AASHTO, both on the travel logistics and on the agenda itself. And at the end of this webinar, if you have any questions about the travel, hotel, or anything related to next week's trip, we'll be available to answer any questions that you have. So that is an overview of today's webinar and next week's workshop. And now I will turn it over to Jeff to talk about the current process and what exists today.
Okay, thanks, Louisa. Why don't we go to the next slide? I'm Jeff Purdy with the Office of Freight Management and Operations at FHWA headquarters. And what I'm going to do is just sort of give you an overview of the Sharp 2 C20 product, the expected outcomes and products of that project, and then talk a little bit about the regional forums that we're doing on freight data as part of the project. Next slide. Now the C20, Sharp 2 C20 implementation program is basically looking at freight demand modeling and data improvements and developing a strategic plan for that. We've been Federal Highways and AASHTO has been working on this for a few years now. We'll be going through next year in terms of implementation. But really what we're looking at is trying to develop improved methods for developing and sharing of freight data sets and freight modeling practices. As part of this, we're taking a look at the analysis of the current state of practice for freight decision-making needs and where there's gaps and where there could be improvement, both in terms of modeling as well as data, which we're going to be talking about at the workshop. And then finally, we're going to end up with a strategic plan to guide future advances in freight modeling and data sharing. Next slide, please. Now, basically, the purpose of the C20 project is to foster fresh ideas and new approaches to freight demand modeling, data collection that ultimately enhance decision making. And so, specifically, the goals of what we're trying to do with this is, number one, to build capacity to utilize current and future freight data and modeling initiatives, to develop and document new and enhanced methods, tools, and approaches for freight data and modeling. And then to advance the state of the practice through data quality and modeling improvements so that freight considerations can more fully be considered in transportation decision making. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the regional forum and the approach that we're going to be taking with this is we're going to be talking about identifying freight data program and improvement needs, identifying areas of collaboration and standardization throughout the region, and then developing an action plan for next steps. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about is, what brings us together? What are the data needs and gaps? What are your planning needs in terms of utilizing freight data? What questions and issues are there with the data? Which freight data sources do you use that help meet your needs? What data is missing and what data might be needed in the future? In terms of looking at regional coalitions, are there partnership opportunities for sharing data? What are potential partners to be able to work together, whether it's local, regional, state, DOT, adjacent states, corridor coalitions? What are the common data needs? And what collaborations can fill those common data needs in terms of data sharing and data development? What are your top regional priorities for enhancing freight data? What are the roles that the different agencies can serve in that? And then finally, looking towards advancing the priorities that we identify out of the workshops, what are follow-up actions that we'll want to take in terms of advancing some sort of regional coalition? What are the next steps to advance each of the priorities that we come up with? What is the best means of communicating to advance these priorities? And then what are the goals that we ultimately want to achieve towards these priorities? Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the current state of the practice and what we have in terms of tools, data, and the limitations that we have in the current state of the practice, looking at tools, we have a variety of different modeling tools that are available, but a lot of these don't really accurately reflect the nature of supply chains and the complexities of logistics practices in terms of freight-dependent industries. And so there's a lot of improvements that we can make in terms of the tools. In terms of the data, we've got certain data sources that are either local or state, as well as data that's available at the national level. But a lot of those data points don't necessarily tie together. Working with national data, trying to distill that down to the local level to determine the share that a region or a state may have in a nationwide economic data set is sometimes difficult. And so there's the need to get a process for helping to disaggregate some of the national level data and then tying it to the local data that's available either at the region or the MPO or the state. And then finally, in terms of the limitations, there's a variety of limitations in terms of the current state of the practice that we'll be working towards trying to find best practices to overcome these. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the implementation plan, we have some short-term objectives, including pilot projects that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, as well as national objectives that we really see as continuing work. Once the SHARP 2 pilot programs are complete, once the regional workshops are complete, we're going to continue working on this, these national initiatives towards long-term improvements. Next slide, please. Now, looking at some of these long-term national initiatives that we're looking at, we have the data standardization and sharing, promoting advanced research, and then outreach and information and improvement in some of the models and practices that we have. In terms of data, looking at standard freight data, such as the commodity flow survey, or we have the freight analysis framework, and looking at ways that this can be disaggregated down to a state or regional or local level, improvements in that area. Also looking at developing and refining forecast and modeling practices to reflect the real world of supply chain management, and making sure that these models are consistent with economic and demographic characteristics of communities. And then establishing methods to maximize the beneficial use of new freight analytical tools, and developing new and enhanced visualization tools. And really, the ultimate goal is to improve and expand the knowledge base for planners and decision makers throughout the program. Next slide, please. Now, as part of the SHARP 2 C20 project, we have 11 proof of concept pilot sites, and basically these pilot sites are looking at improvements to freight modeling and data to help public and private sector decision makers make better and more informed decisions related to transportation, infrastructure, land use, economic development, and transportation policies. 4 of the pilots are developing behavior-based freight models, and 7 of the pilots are implementing innovative local freight data practices. Next slide, please. These are the 11 pilot sites. Basically, we have 7 of the sites are looking at innovations in local freight data, and this includes identifying and adapting different data sources for use in freight modeling and projections, refining current data source, and developing data sources on smaller geographic scales. And then we have the other 4 sites that are doing behavior-based freight modeling. They're basically developing an advanced tour-based or supply chain-based freight model, and then working towards improving the understanding of decision-making by freight agents and their implications on the network. Within the region that we're working in, we have 2 of these pilot sites. One is Portland Metro, that is developing a activity-based or supply chain-based freight model. And then we also have Washington State DOT that's collecting data on industry with regard to truck volume and food distribution and wheat commodity supply, and looking at the sort of the logistics chain of that supply system, and how that affects the transportation, or how transportation policies affect that supply chain for that industry. Next slide, please. Now, once these pilot projects are completed, we'll be evaluating the process and the result to see if we have, what transferable best practices and lessons learned that we develop out of these that can be shared. We're basically looking at, trying to evaluate the project towards meeting the SHARP 2 or C20 initiatives, which include determining how economic, demographic, and other factors and conditions drive freight patterns and characteristics, developing freight data resources for application at sub-regional levels, establishing a pool and standardized portfolio of core freight data sources and data sets that support planning, programming, and project prioritization, and then developing a range of freight forecasting methods and tools that can address decision making at the national, state, regional, and local level. Next slide, please. And so this is our contact information, and if you have any questions or would like any more information, and with that, I'll turn it over to Don, who's going to talk a little bit more about the regional workshop.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Donald, are you still on the line? Is anyone else not hearing Donald's presentation?
I'm also not hearing him.
Okay.
Not hearing it.
Donald, you may be on mute.
Yeah, I'm not hearing it either.
Donald, you may be on mute.
I just sent him an audio pin. So.
This is Donald, Brian.
There we go.
Hey, Donald.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Technology. I thought I was connected via the webinar, but anyway. Okay, well, we'll go from here. So I'm going to talk a bit today about freight data uses and decision making. Really want to kind of focus on the sweet spot here that we're aiming for with this meeting, which is to be able to find ways for people to collaborate on data sharing and data development. So that's really what the focus will be. Next slide. So the key questions I want to go through, and I'll go through some of these fairly quickly because we'll be spending more time both going through these and discussing these as a group on the first day of the workshop. So one of the things that we'd like to talk about is how agencies are using freight data. Where do they get the data? When does it make sense to share or collaborate on data? What are examples of some of the regional collaboration and sharing, and how should you prepare for the workshop? We've talked about that a little bit, and I'm going to offer some very specific advice on how you can prepare for the workshop so that it is as useful as possible. Next slide. So there's some questions that agencies are asking of their freight data and ways in which they're using it. One of the key questions they're asking is, how is the freight system comprised? And to answer that question, they're using a lot of different types of data. One of the key questions that agencies are grappling with right now is, what is the freight network? And this is prompted in part by FAST Act requirements to identify the critical urban freight corridors and the critical rural freight corridors. And agencies are using the data to be able to make some logical assumptions and decisions about what those networks look like. It's an unprecedented period, really, for the use of freight data for these types of purposes, especially with some of the new FAST Act money that is attached for freight-specific projects. Often we ask which industries are using the system. We want to know not only what commodities are flowing over the system, but what industries are using the system and how that's anchored to our economy, and freight data helps us get there. And then we often ask how the system is performing, and that informs a lot of the decisions that we're making. Is it reliable? Is it safe? If not, where are the delays? Where are the safety issues? Which trends and needs and issues are likely to affect freight movements in the future, and what is causing the delays? So there's a lot there. Next slide. Another set of questions that we ask is, what is the nature of the specific deficiencies, and what are the potential solutions for those needs? So after we've identified where the trucks are flowing, where the freight's flowing, whether it's on rail or highway or waterway, where are the specific deficiencies that are affecting the freight industry? Obviously, we collect a lot of this through interviews and stakeholder consultation that agencies do. with their freight shippers and carriers, but we also want to be able to underpin that, and agencies are using data to do that. Looking specifically at projects and how the improvement of those specific deficient segments or pieces of infrastructure would improve outcomes, and more specifically, which actions will provide the best return, the best value for dollar. The little visual that you see on this slide is one that I rather like because it's a bottleneck that I used to live through, and a lot of other people did too. In the top picture, you'll see a lot of trucks queuing. This was the I-95 approach to the Wilson Bridge. But after the Wilson Bridge was completed, of course, there was a significant capacity expansion. You'll see that the bottleneck was essentially significantly reduced, and for most of the day flows freely. Point here is that we need to be able to have the tools and the data to be able to identify the before and after, to be able to have these types of stories, to use the freight data to look at how those trucks were affected, their speeds, what they were carrying, and how they affected the economy. Next slide. So another set of questions is which improvements would address the deficiencies, and we mentioned this a little bit on the last slide, but specifically, will it be a specific improvement? Is it a portfolio approach? And how will those improvements or combination of improvements affect reliability and safety? All of these questions are related to the outcome of wanting to improve freight and goods movement. That's really what's underpinning these questions, and then the need for data to answer them. Next slide. So where do agencies obtain data? This is my short list, and I think it would be interesting to hear where others obtain the data, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about this at the actual workshop. But I've just quickly categorized it into a few different buckets. First, federal sources, and I've used all acronyms, assuming that folks are familiar with a lot of these, but the FAF, the CFS, the carload waybill sample, Army Corps data, freight performance measurements, measure data, NPM-RDS, HPMS, and others. States often are supplying the networks using a specific routing network, GIS layers, classification counts, and even survey data, electronic or truck surveys. Where we see a lot of changes right now is the way that states are thinking about how they're collecting data, and I should say states and MPOs, and how so many of the new sources of data will impact the way in which this happens in the future, including image collection and a number of different other technologies that are emerging. Then there are local sources sometimes. Those can include zoning, land use information, other kinds of pieces of data that we need to be able to tell the full story. There's vendor data that we can purchase that ranges from very expensive to reasonable. And it just depends on what it is, how much we're buying, how granular the data are, and what we're going to use it for. There's also other agency data that may not be related to transportation, but will certainly inform freight data analysis, and that could come from your Department of Agriculture or your Department of Commerce, potentially. And then there's shipper and carrier data, which reflects a vast and mostly untapped reserve of information about the supply chain and how it's functioning. And I think we're seeing a lot of interest in this type of data right now. It's largely been encumbered by privacy concerns to this point, but there are some states and agencies that are finding ways to be able to integrate that supply chain data into their freight data approaches. So we will, again, talk quite a bit more about where your data is coming from, but just wanted to give you an overview of some of the common sources that we're seeing across different agencies in the country. Next. One of the things we will talk about briefly here and more during the workshop is what motivates collaboration. One of the frequent issues is cross-jurisdictional coordination. Many of us live in MPOs or in states that have close boundaries. We share infrastructure. We depend on each other, and we rely on some level of coordination to make good decisions about our investments and our programs. And that's really one of the principal motivators out there. Last year, it was last year if you recall, on I-10 in Southern California, there was a major storm, and the result was at a little town called Desert Center, half of I-10 was washed out. And at that point, Arizona DOT and California DOT, which depend on this link I-10 to connect Phoenix and Los Angeles, went into action with their data to quickly identify not only the proper truck detours, but also working with some GPS data, and ATRI specifically looked at the impact of the diversion. And so it's very powerful. A very powerful motivator is the proximity and the shared boundaries, and the fact that we all rely on many of these shared corridors for the economic lifeblood of our states. Another potential motivator is shared resources. A lot of data are expensive. The staff required, the systems and the collection methods can be expensive, especially for small agencies, and that can be a motivator to share and collaborate. Next slide. There's a lot of data gaps out there that are also motivators or potential motivators for sharing. Jeff shared a list. I've got more here, and we'll talk about even more at the workshop. But there's certainly some gaps out there that are persistent and that I think could greatly benefit from collaboration. One of them is looking at the quality of linked trips across modes. Often we get chunks of the movement of cargo, but we don't really know where and when it's transferred from mode to mode. We don't have a really very good idea of how international trade moves domestically, where the container goes once it hits the dock. But there's a lot that could be said for linking data sets, including vehicles, commodities, value, safety, and performance, being able to pull all those things together. Sometimes we have poor commodity coverage. One specific example is biofuels. Often local delivery and short haul are not accounted for. And there's a lot of continued research and going on right now looking at how to improve short haul trucking movements. Local planning data is not often granular enough, meaning we don't have again, the last mile and location specific data to be able to do what we need to. We're also often missing cost data, and there's scarce data on the nature of private trucking carriers. So this is just a smattering of a few of those points that have been kind of persistent problems for the freight data community for a long time, and I think offer us an opportunity to incubate ideas and find ways to collaborate. Next. So a couple of other ideas on collaboration motivation. One is it's really critical to be able to find partners, either other agencies, private sector stakeholders, potentially universities. We've got to be able to identify shared challenges, which is something that we will spend a bit of time in our breakout sessions doing, is talking to one another, identifying not only our freight data needs, but our shared challenges, and then being able to identify potential solutions to tackle those challenges. And for many of these things, there is no silver bullet, but the small incremental changes and working together to leverage each other's data and resources can often make a big difference. Next. This is something we're calling the freight data sharing spectrum, and I would say this is very much in beta format. What we've got here is basically an idea of where the different data sets that you may be using fall on a spectrum. On the left side of the spectrum, we're calling that maybe less beneficial for sharing. These are common denominator data sets that pretty much everybody has access to. As we move from left to right, things get more interesting. In the middle, there's a lot of different data sets out there, including, for example, if you're collecting truck counts and you're an MPO and your DOT is also collecting truck counts, and maybe you've got a county doing it and you're not quite all doing it the same way, there could be a lot of benefit in collaborating a bit on how you're doing that, and perhaps even how you're doing surveys or using other data or potentially derivatives that you've created of federal data, value added. On the far right side, we've got things that are either pretty complicated to do on your own or pretty expensive. Often we see multiple entities banding together for a joint vendor data purchase. One of the examples we'll cite at the workshop is the I-95 Corridor Coalition has a new vendor program where they have basically using the pooled power of multiple states to lower the cost of purchasing GPS data from multiple vendors. And it's a really interesting contractual arrangement. So there's a lot of different things to think about there, but this is just, again, something to get you thinking a bit as we go into the conference about the types of data that you have that you're using that might be more amenable to sharing and collaboration. Next. So here's a few examples of collaboration. One that jumps out is the use of permit data, oversized overweight permit data, routine permit data for trucks, and sharing that between states. It's a rich and potentially untapped data source. It's been used pretty effectively by a number of states on a corridor planning basis for things like moving windmills and turbines, but there's a lot that could be done. Truck probe data, we're all collecting it, potentially buying it from different sources, and there may be new ways in the future that we're able to tap even some of our own infrastructure, roadside sensors and other things to be able to look at those things. Truck parking data is another example where states, including a corridor in the middle of the country, the I-70 corridor, is working very effectively at coordinating truck parking information systems. Shared vendor purchase, again, very common. Often states are pulling together or using the power of their MPOs to be able to enhance a data purchase. So there's a lot of other examples, but those are just a few, and you will certainly look forward to hearing about some of the existing examples of collaboration at the workshop. Next. There's a lot of things that obviously make sharing and collaboration hard. Just to hit on a few, there's the legal hurdles. There's certainly standardization and setting the standards that enable our data to be apples to apples. We face limited resources. There are proprietary limitations, this is chiefly the main hurdle for involving the private sector. We have to find a way in which they feel comfortable sharing things, and certainly there are many of them that never will, and we have to recognize that and find ways to involve them in a meaningful way and to be able to obtain data where they are willing to share. There are institutional considerations, and just plain and simply coordination takes time and effort, and it's not always easy. So there's a lot of things in our way, but we want to be able to find kind of mutually beneficial projects and gaps and be able to seed those as a method for developing this regional action plan. But just want to be cognizant of the things that can make it difficult. Next. So there's a lot that you can do to prepare for the workshop. And obviously we're all time constrained, so here's the most critical. First, we want you to really think about what the freight data gaps are facing your agency. We've listed a number of them on the screen between Jeff's slides and mine. And then ask the question, are any of those gaps amenable to sharing or collaboration? And this may require you to think about the policy or planning question you're trying to resolve, whether shared data would help resolve it if you're missing something, maybe even who your potential partners would be. They may be your neighbor, they may be a couple of states over, it may be multiple states, and it may even be a state that's not necessarily involved in this regional workshop, but with whom you may have a lot of trade and shared corridor assets. So those are the kinds of things that we hope you can think about, and we have a very specific activity as well that we will be conducting at this workshop. Next slide. And that is a workshop, a part of our workshop that we're calling Speed Data-ing. At the Orlando workshop, several of the folks said that they they first needed to define what speed speed dating was in order to know what speed dataing was. And we said, well, they may not be the same thing. They just sound alike, and we thought the name was catchy. But the basic idea was, at that workshop, a number of the states and MPOs identified that they said it would be really helpful if everyone would kind of come to the workshop prepared to talk about the data sets that they have in their use, in their data clearinghouse, if you will, and what they may be willing to share. So in preparation for the workshop, we're hoping that you will come with kind of in the back of your pocket a list of the different types of data that you're using for freight, and also the issues and new developments and events that are taking place that kind of prompt the use of that data. And we want you to come and be prepared to share those items. The speed dataing session will actually be an opportunity for you to write down some of the major data sets. We'll post them up, and then have a period of time in which we'll want everybody to take a few minutes and describe the data that they're using and kind of what's motivating them to do that. And we think that'll be an excellent opportunity for everybody in the room to kind of get the lay of the land, if you will. This, we feel, would have been very helpful in the Southeast, where we had a number of MPOs and states who hadn't necessarily talked to each other about these types of issues in the past. And so we think it's a great addition to this workshop. So next slide. So that's all we have, or that's all I have for now on that. I wanted to maybe break and see if there were any questions for either me or Jeff, Brian, or Louisa about how to prepare for next week. And then I think we're going to talk about logistics for a few minutes.
Any questions for Donald or Jeff? Okay.
Hi, this is Barb. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, Donald. Hi, Donald. The type of data always depends on the type of problem you're trying to solve. So when you say what are the freight data gaps, I assume there'll be some focus on gaps to do what, right?
Yes. Yes.
So,
yeah, you're right. It's always driven. It always is driven by the problem. It's not just data gaps for data gaps' sake. You're correct. And I think, you know, this is the first time we will be doing. You know, we're going to be doing 8 of these workshops. This is the second one, and yet this is the first time we will be doing this particular exercise. And I think what we may do is kind of a second iteration within the workshop is once we get the different types of data up on the walls and have folks talk about it a bit. I think that would be a natural progression for us to kind of categorize those based on the problems that we're trying to solve. And it may not be a situation where the data sets are mutually exclusive either. But I think that's where you're going, but let me know if I've missed it. That's kind of what we've anticipated doing.
Sounds good. I'm personally interested in operational problems as well. Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned that, but would you almost put that in a different category, or what are your thoughts?
So making planning and operations distinct, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I was just wondering in how you're going to organize the discussion, if it's all inclusive, or
it's all inclusive. In fact, at the Southeastern workshop that we had in Orlando, we had a number of people there from kind of the TSMO arena, the traffic operations groups, and they often had some of the best comments and insights because they were so appropriately focused on managing performance and congestion and other issues. So it's all of the above. It's the planning, it's the operations, it's the policy, it's the things that we use freight data for as transportation agencies. And Jeff, if you have any perspective on this, please chime in. But that's my understanding and the way that we had it in Florida is all-inclusive, much richer discussion that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, well, thanks, Barb. We'll give that some more thought before next week, but definitely come prepared with your freight data types and also problems, not limited to planning, but including operations.
Any other questions? Okay. As you can see from the last slide, the meeting will take place at the CH2M Hill office in Portland, and the hotel that I believe all of you are staying in is the DoubleTree in Portland. And we will have some more information on getting from the hotel to the offices before you leave. Does anyone have any questions about travel or travel logistics? Okay, Brian, any update on the group dinner? Or are you going to be giving some suggestions on potential locations for a group dinner?
Yes, so those suggestions will be coming out in the follow-up email that I'll be sending shortly after we conclude this call. But that'll include that information as well as the addresses for the hotel and the meeting location, in addition to sending the travel reimbursement forms out again as well.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so I think the biggest advice we can leave you with is to prepare for the workshop by starting to think about means of collaboration. Under what circumstances would you or your region benefit from collaboration, and how would you do that? I think the speed data session may itself generate some new ideas, but we're hoping that you will be coming into the workshop session with your thoughts and perspectives, and we look forward to seeing you in person next week. Anything else from AASHTO or FHWA before we close today's webinar?
Nope, I think we're all looking forward to meeting you and having this conversation.
All right, thank you.
Forward shot.
I'm sorry, Jeff, I interrupted you.
I was just saying I'm looking forward to the workshop.
Great. All right, if there are no other questions, we'll close today's webinar, and we will see you next week in Portland.